Montana Territory, July 1880. The train let out one last hiss of steam and rattled off down the track, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the soft clunk of boots on wood. Frances Kessler sat on a weathered crate just beside the depot, her gloved hands folded in her lap. A carpet bag at her feet and a letter crumpled in her skirt pocket. Her eyes, too tired for 23, scanned the empty platform again. He was not there. The letter had promised he would be. She had memorized the words, "I will meet you myself. Look for a tall man in a brown hat by the station wall. You will know me by my boots, black with silver toes, signed, Everett Collins, her husband-to-be." But there were no brown hats, no silver-toed boots. Just a freight clerk hauling crates, a boy with a broom, and the station agent who had already glanced at her twice like she was a stray dog. The sun pressed down hard, and Frances shifted her weight. She had not eaten since the night before, and her corset pinched at her ribs. Her mouth was dry, but she stayed seated. If she stood, it would mean she had nowhere to go. If she stayed sitting, maybe someone might still come. She reached into the pocket of her travel dress and pulled out the letter again, smoothing the creases. It was dated 2 months back. Had he changed his mind, died, found somebody else? A throat cleared near the depot office. "Ma'am, the station agent called you waiting on someone?" Frances nodded once. "Yes, sir, my fiancé." The man gave a polite grimace. "Train's not due again until tomorrow." She nodded again, slower this time. The agent hesitated, then disappeared inside. Frances kept her eyes on the tracks. She would wait here until dark if she had to. 15 miles west. Wyatt Ellison pulled hard on the reins of his roan gelding and stared down at the broken wheel of the wagon. The blasted thing had cracked clean through when he hit the rut near the creek crossing. He stepped down and crouched beside it, wiping sweat from his brow. "Damn it, Everett," he muttered under his breath. If his cousin had not taken sick last week, Wyatt would not be here. But Everett, bedridden and coughing blood in Helena, had begged him to go to the station in his place. "She's expecting someone," Everett had wheezed. "You go in my stead. Explain it to her. Make sure she's all right." Wyatt had not liked it, but he had agreed. It was the decent thing to do. He had planned to reach the station hours ago, but the wheel had other ideas. He looked back toward the wagon. The spare was cracked too. No way to fix it without proper tools. He cursed again, louder this time, and then turned to his horse. "We ride." The sun was dropping fast behind the hills. He would not get there before dark, but he would get there. He mounted and kicked the gelding into a gallop. The shadows grew long. Frances pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the air was still warm. The platform had emptied, and the depot was locked up for the night. She was alone. No one was coming. She pressed her hand to her chest. She had left everything in Kansas City. Her job at the dry goods store, the boarding house room, her sister. She had sold her locket to buy the train ticket. She had believed in the promises Everett had written, how he wanted a good woman, how he had a homestead with strong fences and 2 milk cows, how he needed someone steady and kind. She had believed he needed her. The silence now told her otherwise. She stood slowly and picked up her carpet bag. Her knees trembled. She stepped off the platform, unsure of where to go. There was a small hotel down the road, but she had only $2 left. It would not last long. "Miss Kessler," the voice behind her was low and rough, like gravel over wood. She turned fast. A man had dismounted his horse near the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, dusty from the trail. His hat was dark gray, not brown, and his boots had plain toes. Not Everett, still his eyes were kind. "I am Wyatt Ellison," he said, stepping closer. Everett's cousin, Frances, froze. Wyatt removed his hat. "He took ill last week, fever. I came in his place. He asked me to meet you. I am sorry I am late." The wagon broke down. She stared at him. "He's not coming." Wyatt's jaw tensed. "No, ma'am, he is in no state to travel," he thought. You would be better off knowing. Francis swallowed hard. So he sent you only to explain and to make sure you are safe. She did not know whether to cry or scream. Wyatt looked at her bag. Did you have a place to stay? No. He nodded, then looked away. There is a boarding inn in town. I will cover the cost. It is the least I can do. I do not take charity. His eyes met hers again. Then call it a debt for wasting your time. She hesitated, then finally nodded. He led her down the road, walking beside her with his horse trailing behind. They did not speak for a while. The sky turned violet above them. Wyatt cleared his throat. You must be real brave. She glanced at him. Why coming all this way alone for someone you never met? Francis shrugged. I thought it would be different. He gave a quiet nod. Me too. The innkeeper gave Francis a room with a slanted ceiling and a narrow bed. The wash basin was chipped and the window would not open, but it was dry and private. Wyatt paid for 3 nights, left the coins on the counter, and tipped his hat once before heading back out. Francis stood by the small window and watched him ride off into the dark. She had just met him, but something about the way he handled her, gentle, steady, with no false kindness, stuck in her chest. She sat on the bed and let her hands fall to her lap. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe this was not the end of everything. She closed her eyes and told herself to sleep. Wyatt did not sleep. He camped out near the wagon under a sky full of stars and thought about her eyes, not the color. He could not even name it. But the way they had looked when she asked, "So he sent you." He had seen that look before, on soldiers in camps, on mothers with no food left on himself. Once or twice he pulled his coat tighter against the cold. He had not expected her to be so proud, or so quiet, or so strong. Everett had not deserved her, and Wyatt could not stop thinking about the way she had stood up straight even when her world had fallen sideways. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would see her again. Tomorrow. The morning light came slow and gold through the slanted window pane, glancing off the washstand and catching in the loose strands of Francis's hair. She stood at the mirror, pinning her braid into a crown before lifting the last of her clean collars from her valise. It was creased from the journey, but wide enough. Downstairs, the dining room smelled faintly of coffee and fried cornmeal. She stepped carefully into the room, unsure if she'd be welcome. But the innkeeper's wife waved her toward a table without fuss. She ate in silence, folding each bite with care, her eyes on the lace edge of the tablecloth. She hadn't decided what to do next, only that she would not stay idle. Wyatt came in just after she finished tall and dusted with trail, his shirt damp at the edges from the pump-out back. He carried his hat in one hand and paused when he saw her. I hoped you'd still be here, he said, voice low. Francis folded her napkin. I have nowhere else. He didn't sit until she nodded. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and leaned his elbows on the table, careful not to crowd her. I took a look at the wagon, he said. Axles cracked. I'll need to get a new one sent in from Red Lodge. Could be a week. She met his eyes. And why are you telling me this? He shifted slightly. Because I thought I might ride out to the homestead this afternoon. Bring back supplies, maybe set up a space for you, if you'd rather not stay in town. She watched him closely. I was promised a place there. Yes, ma'am, he said. And I mean to see that you get it. Francis looked down at her folded napkin, then back up. I'm not a charity case. No, you're not, he answered. But you were given a promise. I figure it deserves to be honored, even if not the way you expected. She studied him a moment longer. You're not like him. Wyatt's jaw flexed. No, I'm not. For a few breaths, neither of them spoke. Then she stood smoothing her skirt. I'll come with you, his brow rose. To the homestead. I can ride, she said. And I won't be left behind again. He stood too slowly. All right. They left by mid-morning, Wyatt leading a second horse borrowed from the livery. He adjusted the stirrups for her without comment and handed her the reins with a nod. The trail west opened quiet and wide dust rising in soft clouds from the horses' hooves. They rode without much talk, the wind carrying the scent of pine and river water. Francis didn't ask questions, and Wyatt didn't fill the silence. Midday found them by a narrow stream. Francis dismounted without help, crossing to the bank and kneeling to splash her face. Wyatt stayed back, giving her space. "You were in the war?" she asked suddenly, not turning. "I was. Cavalry infantry, Missouri regiment." She stood slowly, drying her hands on her skirt. "You came back whole." He looked at her, then down. Not entirely. They didn't speak of it again. The sun climbed higher, and they rode on. By late afternoon, the land began to change. Fewer cottonwoods, more sage. The fence line appeared, first weathered posts leaning in the wind, and then the house, modest 2 rooms, wood smoke curling from the chimney. Francis dismounted stiffly. Wyatt led the horses to the trough, then reached for the door. "I'll let you go in first," he said. She stepped inside alone. The room smelled of ash and dry wood. A stove sat in the corner, cold but clean. There was a table with 1 chair, a cot against the far wall, and a trunk at the foot of it. No curtains, but the window lit in the soft light of evening. She stood for a long moment, then turned back to the door. Wyatt hadn't moved. "It's yours now if you want it." She stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. "It's plain. It's solid," he said. She looked toward the hills, the wind lifting her hair. "I can work, I can sew and keep hens. I'm not afraid of dirt. I didn't think you were." She turned to him fully then. "Why are you really helping me?" He didn't look away. "Because when I saw you standing there, looking like you'd been torn up and stitched back wrong, I knew I couldn't ride past it." Her eyes narrowed. "And what do you want in return?" "I don't want anything." "You don't want to give?" he said simply. Francis folded her arms, but not in defiance. Just to steady herself. "I'll need time. You can have it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. "I'll sleep in the barn," he added, "until you decide what comes next." She nodded once. "I'd like some coffee if you have any." He smiled, faint and tired. "I'll start the fire." They walked back toward the house together, step for step. Neither of them reached for the door first, but when he opened it, she stepped inside ahead of him. The stove crackled low as the coffee boiled. Francis sat near the hearth, hands wrapped around a tin cup, her fingers still from the trail's long grip. Wyatt moved quietly behind her, setting a sack of oats on the shelf, then unlacing his boots by the door. The hush between them wasn't cold. It held something watchful, like wind through tall grass. "I'll take the cot," she said without looking up. "You said the barn, but this place is too far out to sleep apart." He nodded once, then settled cross-legged near the wall. Arms resting over his knees, the firelight flickered across the lines at the corners of his eyes. "He didn't argue you build this?" she asked, tapping the rim of her cup. "My father did. I helped raise the fence line, but he set the beams. He's still living." "No. Died during the hard winter 4 years back." She studied the shadow his boots cast on the floorboards, and your mother buried beside him. Francis nodded once, then sipped. "Mine passed when I was 12. Consumption. Pa followed not long after. Some men can't stand to be alone." Wyatt didn't speak for a while. "Then you had to manage from there. My older sister took work in town. I joined her once I was old enough to iron shirts and count change." He shifted his weight slightly. "Is she still back east? She married a wheelwright. Got 2 boys now. I didn't want to be the aunt in the corner room forever." The cup in her hands had cooled. She stood and poured what remained into the basin, then set it upside down on the shelf. "You know Wyatt said there's a patch of ground north of the house that's been left fallow too long. Good for a garden if the spring stays wet. That's hopeful thinking. It's good land, he said. Just need someone who'll tend it regular. Frances reached behind her to unpin her hair, shaking out the braid. And you figure that someone's me? I figure you've got your own mind about it. She turned, watching him in the fire's low light. Would you still want me here if Everett had come instead? He met her gaze without flinching. He didn't, and I'm not sorry. She crossed the room slow and even and knelt to fold the quilt at the foot of the cot. I don't know what comes next. I'm not asking you to, he said. Not tonight. The fire burned down to its last orange glow. Frances stood and pulled the quilt up over the cot, then lay back with her arms crossed beneath her head. Wyatt stretched out along the floor using his rolled coat for a pillow. They lay in silence until the wind shifted outside and a loose shutter tapped against the siding. Your boots, she said into the dark. What about them? They don't have silver toes. He let out a low breath, almost a laugh. Never cared for Flash, she smiled to herself unseen. Neither do I. The wind quieted and the room settled into stillness again. Wyatt's breathing evened, and Frances stared at the slanted ceiling. Her body heavy with fatigue, but her thoughts strangely light. She hadn't come looking for this. She hadn't come looking for him. But she wasn't sorry either. The next morning brought low clouds and the scent of wet dirt. Rain had come in the night, just enough to leave puddles along the edge of the barn and darken the porch boards. Frances stood at the threshold, arms folded, watching a pair of magpies dart between the fence posts. Wyatt stepped out from the barn, sleeves rolled, his shirt damp at the collar from chopping kindling. He didn't speak right away, only nodded toward the stack of wood near the door, before setting the axe against the wall. I'll patch the corner of the henhouse today, he said. Roof started to sag. Frances turned slightly. There are hens to go with it, not yet. But I figured if the roof's sound, you might want to see about getting some. She nodded once, but didn't move from her place by the door. Wyatt's gaze lingered on her. You sleep all right, I did, she said. Woke once when the wind picked up. Thought I heard a wagon, but it was just rain on the trough. He stepped up beside her, not too close. You expecting someone? No, she said simply. Then after a pause, but I dreamed I was back at the depot. Alone again. Felt like I'd never left. Wyatt looked toward the horizon. Dreams'll do that, pull you back into what you thought you'd outrun. I didn't think I'd outrun anything, she said. I just thought it might be different here. He let the silence settle before answering. It still could be. Frances turned to face him fully. I want to do something useful today, not just sit and wait for the stove to heat. I've got a shed full of gear that needs sorting, he said. Could you someone who can tell a needle from a nail? I'll start there then. He stepped aside, letting her pass down the porch steps before following her around the side of the house. The shed leaned slightly westward, its door hanging from one hinge. The inside a scatter of rusted tools, tangled rope, and a cracked seed grinder. Frances rolled up her sleeves and knelt by the pile. You keep everything you've ever touched? Wyatt crouched beside her. Hard to throw things away when the town's half a day's ride and money's always thin. She lifted a broken lantern. This one's past fixing. I've got others. She set it aside and reached for a coil of wire. This could patch a fence. They worked in quiet rhythm, sorting what could be salvaged from what couldn't. By noon, she had a stack of usable items near the door and a pile of scrap ready for melt or burn. Wyatt leaned on the doorframe, watching her tie the last bundle of wire with a strip of cloth. You've got a good eye for what's worth keeping. I had to learn, she said. When you've only got one drawer to keep things in, you figure out what matters. He stepped inside, brushing sawdust from an old workbench. You ever want to leave Kansas City before you answered Everett's letter? She sat back on her heels. Yes. He waited. I used to watch the trains pass, wondered where they were going. I didn't care much where, just wanted to be on one. Wyatt nodded. I rode one once after the war. Slept sitting up between two men snoring like bulls. Still felt like freedom. Francis smiled, faintly, eyes on the floor. Funny how much we'll trade for that feeling. They stood at the same time, both brushing grit from their hands. I'll heat a kettle, she said. We can eat outside. He followed her to the house, and soon they sat on the porch, with tin cups of boiled potatoes and salt pork between them. The sky had cleared just enough to let the warmth through. Wyatt leaned back against the post. You ever think about what you'd do if you got to build something from the start? Frances traced the rim of her cup, a place where nothing was borrowed, where the walls were mine. I'd grow beans, keep a butter churn, maybe teach reading if the neighbors had children. He looked over at her. That sounds like something worth building. She met his eyes. Would you help? I would. They didn't speak after that, just sat as the breeze moved the grass and the sun crept down toward the far ridge. Neither of them looked away. The snow came early that year. By the first week of October, frost clung like lace to the porch railings, and the pasture grass dulled to a silvered gold. Frances pulled her shawl tight as she stepped outside with the basket of laundry breath rising in small clouds. The sun had barely crested the ridge, but the stove was already warm, and biscuits were rising under a cloth in the kitchen. Wyatt had risen before her again. He was somewhere out in the lower field laying new fence posts before the ground turned too hard. She could hear the faint rhythm of his hammer, steady and distant. She set the basket on a stump and began pinning shirts to the line. Her stitches ran neat along the cuffs she'd taken to reinforcing the seams of his work shirts in the evenings while he cleaned tools or mended the barn latch. They didn't speak much during those hours, but something passed between them, quiet and complete, like a song sung under breath. The hens clucked lazily near the coop, pecking at the feed she'd scattered before dawn. The three oldest had already quit laying, but she let them stay. They'd earned peace. By mid-morning, Wyatt came up the path, gloves tucked into his belt, cheeks reddened from the wind. He paused near the porch when he saw her at the line, but she didn't look up until she felt his steps behind her. Post Holden, she asked, reaching for another clothespin. Dry earth near the cottonwoods might need to soak it tonight. Frances nodded. I boiled the last of the black beans. They'll keep warm till noon. He studied her a moment, then reached past her to lift a damp sleeve. You still thinking about leaving? She turned her face toward his, the line between them flapping once in the breeze. I did at first, and now I wake up before the sun. I tend a stove I didn't build, feed hens I didn't buy, and sleep in a bed that still creaks under my weight. She rested her hands on her hips. But I don't feel like I'm borrowing anymore. He nodded slowly. You're not. They stood quiet again. Frances pulled the last shirt from the basket and pinned it beside the others. The line swayed gently, cloth brushing cloth. I got a letter yesterday, Wyatt said after a moment. She looked up. From Everett. He's back on his feet, staying with kin near Butt. She didn't answer right away. He asked about you. Frances dusted her hands on her apron. Did you write him back? Not yet. She met his eyes fully. Don't tell him anything more than he needs to know. I won't. The wind picked up and Wyatt reached to steady the basket. Frances caught his hand without thinking. His skin was warm, calloused from the work, but his grip softened as their fingers settled together. I didn't expect to feel at home again, she said. But I do. Wyatt stepped closer, their hands still joined. I didn't expect to want more than what I had. But I do now. Frances's throat tightened. Can I ask you something? Anything? Would you build another room onto the house? One with space for a cradle beside the stove, his chest lifted with the breath he drew, and something in his face, something unguarded and wide, answered before his voice did. I already drew the plans. She laughed, a sound she hadn't made in years, and pressed her forehead to his chest. They stood like that until the sun climbed above the trees. That winter settled deep and quiet over the hills. They spent the dark months side by side, stitching curtains, sealing cracks in the walls, watching the fire die down to embers and rise again. They spoke of planting beans and squash come spring, of ordering a milk cow from a neighbor due north, of finding a name that would suit a child raised among fences and pine. By March, the new room stood small but warm, with a window that caught the morning light just right. Frances moved her mending basket to a low bench by the cradle and began stitching a quilt from old shirts and flour sacks. Wyatt carved toys from leftover cedar, smoothing each edge by hand. The baby came just after the thaw, a girl with strong lungs and wide dark eyes. They named her Lily for the wildflowers that bloomed near the creek when the snow melted. Frances held her close that first night, Wyatt seated beside the bed, his hand resting on the curve of her knee. "I never thought I'd be needed like this," she whispered. He leaned in, brushing her temple with his lips. "You're not just needed," he said. "You're home." The lamp burned low. Outside, the wind shifted through the eaves, soft and sure. And inside the house they had built together, slowly, honestly, and with care, the three of them breathed as one.